Thank you. It's a pleasure and to be here for the first meeting of the water group. And I need to get on your mailing list so that I can participate in the group's activities. So, do you see my first slide?
Yes.
Good. So what I'm going to do today is hopefully spur a conversation about some of what I think are critical issues in studying in water governance and in studying water governance, and also lay out an approach that I think can be productive in addressing some of these issues. But I'm very interested in hearing your questions and getting your feedback. And so today I want to cover these topics. I want to spend a little time talking about changing water cycles. And a lot of that comes out of the latest IPCC report and some other science articles. And then talk a little bit about both the sociological and ecological impacts, but also the governance challenges of having water settings that are relatively new to us, although they may have appeared in prior prior periods in Earth's history. And then spend some time talking about adaptive and forward-looking water governance, which is what I think that to be successful in addressing these new problems that are emerging, we'll have to move more towards. So just for a little context, of course, we have to start with this graph of the greenhouse gas emissions over the 20th and 21st centuries, and then the related anthropogenic warming. The goal of the Paris Climate Accords is to keep warming at or below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we're rapidly approaching that much heating into the atmosphere, and that type of greenhouse gas emissions, or that level of greenhouse gas emissions, is even now affecting water cycles. And if we don't meet the Paris goals, we're going to see catastrophic change. So the change in water cycles is driven by the inability of countries to address greenhouse gas emissions adequately. So we see changing water cycles. The water cycles that people currently experience are different than the water cycles that existed in most regions of the world earlier in the 20th century. And so what this map shows is the population of people who are experiencing a wetter world, and that's in green. And the darker the green, the larger the population, and the populations that are experiencing decreasing levels of participation. So this is a global phenomena, and regional water cycles are changing. Largely, the Earth, we're becoming wetter. Because of the increasing heat, the atmosphere can hold more moisture. It comes down in precipitation. So overall, we're going to see a wetter Earth. But probably even more concerning is that precipitation events are going to become and have become more extreme. These are satellite images from NASA Earth Observatory, focusing on the Indus River and the extensive flooding that occurred this past summer. And the first image is from June 24th, before monsoon rains began. Then the next image is the end of August, where following torrential monsoon rains, and you can see the extensive flooding up and down the Indus River. And even in October, you can still see a lot of water remaining on the landscape as so much water or so much precipitation fell that it was difficult to move that water off of the landscape, and more of it was trapped. So it led to widespread destruction, crops, infrastructure, deaths. And that's one end of a changing water cycle, is extreme precipitation events and extreme flooding. The other end of it is what's happening where I live, which is we're currently in what scientists call a mega drought. And so the map on the left is the Colorado River Basin, and the Colorado River is the major river providing water for 7 states in the southwestern US. It provides water even to Los Angeles through aqueducts that take it out of the river basin and over to Los Angeles. And so different population areas outside of the basin receive water, and then the population areas within the basin. And that's where Tucson is, where I am. Anyway, mega drought, there's been lower than average precipitation in this region over the last 2 decades. And this graphic on the bottom right is from the US Drought Monitor, and darker colors are more extreme drought and lighter colors are less extreme drought. And you could take, and they produce this map weekly. You could take a look at this map every week and go back for 20 years, and largely you're going to see a map that looks something like this. Sometimes drought is more severe, sometimes it's less severe, but this is what it's going to look like. And the consequences is that for the major reservoirs on the Colorado River are declining, and they're declining to such a degree where there's now concerns about the operability of the reservoirs and whether they are going to eventually, without significant cutbacks in water uses, they'll eventually become useless. So the other aspect of changing water cycles, and partly what's driving some of the water issues here in the southwestern US, but really in different parts of the world, is that glaciers and snow are disappearing. And on the left is a picture of a glacier from Pakistan. So there's melting of the higher mountain glaciers that will eventually end up in declining flows from glaciers. And on the right is snowpack over time, over the last several decades in the western US. All of the rivers in the western US are snow dominated, and increasingly precipitation is in the form of rain, not in the form of snow, and that has a real impact on water supplies because snowpack is a major source or holder of water that is then primarily used in agriculture. So these are just some examples of how water cycles are changing globally. We're becoming increasingly wetter world. Major sources of water that have been relied upon for different activities are declining, and then precipitation patterns and river flows are changing. And so historically, we've managed under the assumption that water cycles are relatively stable. They vary within a range, but that's no longer the case. And so that's what scientists mean by a non-analog world or non-analog water cycles, is that these are new or novel to people now, but also to the management systems that we have in place. So we need to, well, I'm just going to spend a moment before jumping ahead, that these changing water cycles also have significant social and ecological impacts. There are negative impacts on agricultural production with changing water cycles and having to adapt to these changing water cycles. The expectation is that without significant forms of adaptation, we'll see declines in most of the major food crops that we rely upon, especially grains. There's the transformation of ecosystems that's currently happening in the Western US, where we have significant and extensive forest fires every year. And the Western US is going to continue to burn for the next couple of decades, even if we get a handle on greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's what the graphic on the left is, that wildfires have substantially increased because of climate change. And part of it, it's just a warming atmosphere, but it's also because it's also drier, and extensive droughts in the West have killed off trees and have led to more wildfires. It has negative impacts on human health, from water quality to inadequate water supplies to extreme floods that then lead to different outbreaks of disease. And then there's undermining of infrastructure, especially of water infrastructure. Electricity generation may become more problematic, especially for reservoirs in the midst of mega droughts. And just having infrastructure that can provide the water supplies that are necessary are becoming undermined. And so anyway, this is all, really just to say that there are significant issues and problems that require substantial, even transformative governance to address if we're going to limit negative human impacts and negative impacts on ecological systems. So let me take a look about the time. Okay, so the governance challenges of non-analog water settings, there's multiple, and I couldn't possibly list them all out, but these are the three that I think are some of the most pressing. Certainly the first one, where uses and management are mismatched now to the water cycle. So for instance, and I'm going to give you mostly examples out of the Western US, since that's what I'm most familiar with, the timing of river flows are becoming increasingly out of sync with the timing of agriculture. And so we're seeing earlier snow melt and snow runoff, which historically has happened later in the spring and into the early summer when farmers are planting their crops. But now we see major melt before and runoff, or increasing levels of runoff before farmers have their crops planted. There are water sharing agreements among most of the Western states on the rivers that they share. And the water sharing agreements almost inevitably have some calendar in them where the upstream state has to begin sharing a certain amount of water to the downstream state at a certain point in time. And that certain point in time no longer makes any sense, or the upstream state can't deliver that level of water because much of it has already flown by or flowed by. So there's just these governance or these management mismatches. And then I've already mentioned the declining value of water infrastructure. And at least in the Western US, what's emerging are more disagreements and conflicts over water allocation and water use. And so I just want to just spend a minute, because I think this graphic is, from my perspective and for the work that I do, this is like, wow, this is a super cool graphic. And it shows the major reservoirs in the Western US that are managed by a federal agency called the Bureau of Reclamation, which has built and operated these reservoirs beginning in the early 20th century. And really what I want you to focus on are these three reservoirs that I have circled here in green. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are the two major reservoirs on the Colorado River, and they're two of the largest reservoirs in the US. And then on the Rio Grande River, which forms the international border with Mexico, there's a large reservoir called the Elephant Butte Reservoir. And what you can see with these three reservoirs, what this shows is the blue area is the current level in the reservoir. The red dot is the 30-year average of the reservoir at this date. And so you can see that these reservoirs are significantly depleted compared to their 30-year average at this point in time. And this has led to the 7 basin states in the Colorado River Basin and the federal government to begin negotiations of how to substantially reduce water uses. And by that, I mean by 20 to 30% over typical use levels. And the Rio Grande River, the conflict between allocating that water between Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas has reached the point now where it's in court and it's before the US Supreme Court. And there's also discussion of perhaps eliminating Elephant Butte Reservoir because it sits at such a low elevation and so much evaporation occurs from it. So anyway, we have if we're interested in water and water governance, we have our work cut out for us because we're facing a new world, a new water world. So not surprisingly then, we have to think long and hard about adaptation. And what I would argue is we need to also think about forward-looking governance. So for water governance and water management, historically, we've assumed that water cycles are stable and that what has come before will continue to guide is an appropriate way of guiding decisions because we can expect stability in water cycles, but that's no longer the case. And so we have to start thinking about how do we adapt our existing water governance arrangements to be much more forward-looking and anticipate, especially the major precipitation events that are going to occur and how to manage the risks of them occurring. And so I begin with this chestnut, or this classic, what I think of as a classic paper. I think it's one of the best descriptions of adaptive governance. And basically just to briefly explain this figure, actually I'm going to advance a slide to explain this figure. The items in the middle boxes are features of adaptive governance, you know, having an information-rich environment, being able to deal with conflict, and so forth. And the green boxes are the strategies that are used to achieve adaptive governance, such as devising rules that are congruent with ecological conditions, or applying graduated sanctions for violations. But what I think is most important for forward-looking adaptive governance is to focus on allocating authority at multiple levels, from local to global, which is one of the green strategy boxes. And the other one is employing mixtures of institutional variety. And these two work hand in hand. There's building evidence, and some of my work speaks to this, that the more autonomy local and regional level governments have, the more innovative they are in developing a variety of different policies. And the less autonomy they're allocated, then the less innovative they are. So allocating authority appropriately across multiple levels is critical if we're also going to see a mixture of institutional arrangements. And that mixture of institutional arrangements is critical because of the changing water cycles and the significant uncertainty in those water cycles. So just briefly, in the last 5 minutes that I have, I want to share with you both what I think is forward-looking governance and then what we need to pay attention to and study for adaptive governance. And I think forward-looking governance focuses on risk and how to anticipate and address that risk by sharing the risk across multiple uses and multiple users. And I'm just going to give examples, a couple of examples just around water scarcity and the risk of water scarcity and how that risk can be better shared across water users and across jurisdictions and governments. So one interesting case that's occurring in the Western US is something called alternative water transfer mechanisms. In the Western US, rural areas are attractive sources of water for cities, especially when mega droughts emerge. But that has negative and devastating consequences for rural economies and rural areas, is to have a municipality buy up and transfer water rights from rural areas. It takes productive agricultural land out of production, and it undermines livelihoods. And so what has occurred, and this is a river in southeastern Colorado, the state of Colorado, and the black line is the river, and the darker black line and the lighter black line are the different irrigation systems off of that river. And the irrigation systems are now coordinating in what they call a super ditch. But what they do is they rotate fallowing across the different irrigation systems and making that water available to lease to cities. So instead of cities buying up water rights and drying up the land, the irrigation systems are making water available for leasing. It protects and maintains rural economies and livelihoods. So that's what I mean by forward-looking governance. And there's other examples of it, from carefully coordinating across using alternative water sources to a more heavier reliance on proportional water allocation rules. But basically, forward-looking governance supports risk sharing, and it also, though, rests on a coordination among different water uses and water users. So to get that kind of coordination and adaptation in existing water management approaches requires that we do some really heavy investment in governance. We need to pay attention to the allocation of authority across levels of government. Do local and regional governments, do they have the scope of authority that they need around different water sources and control of water sources in order to engage in innovative and risk-sharing activities? Do they have the administrative capacity to do so as well? And then, I ask questions about financial resources of local governments. Do they have the resources that they need? But an important part of, and governance tools, can they engage in cooperation? But an important part of this is also local accountability, is that there has to be a way of having citizens and resource users hold local governments accountable for their decision-making. But then there also needs to be attention paid to how local governments interact with central governments. Because what's critical here is to maintain that balance of decision-making authority and limiting the ability of either local governments to undermine the values that are being pursued at a higher level, but also limiting the ability of central governments to undermine the activities of local governments. So there needs to be attention paid to resolving conflicts across different levels of government without undermining the autonomy of either. And then civil society has an important role to play here in being able to advocate and support local and regional governments in the innovations that we're going to have to call upon them to do. So in conclusion, really the best way to handle much of this is we need to limit greenhouse gas emissions so that we avoid catastrophic climate change. But we're also going to have to engage in adaptation. Risk sharing is going to be key as we move forward and try to figure out what are the new forms of water governance we're going to engage in. And then we have to back that up with investment in robust governance. In most of the science articles and the IPCC reports that I've read, there's a lot of listing of different activities that we can engage in. Most of it has to do with hard infrastructure. I don't think enough attention is being paid to adaptive and forward-looking governance. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and take questions.